Hello, welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're going to be reading from Echo North by Joanna Ruth Meyer. This book was inspired by the Norwegian folktale East of the Sun, West of the Moon, and it's also partly inspired by the Scottish folktale Tam Lin. So I thought it would be fun to do a little series on young adult books that are inspired by folktales, and then also read some of the actual folktales that inspired them. This is probably the one that I'm going to be reading next. This is East by Edith Pattou, and it is also inspired by East of the Sun, West of the Moon. In the original story, East of the Sun, West of the Moon, the main character has to marry a great white bear in order to help her family escape from poverty. And she eventually discovers that he's actually a prince who's been cursed, surprise, surprise, to be a bear by day and only take on his human form by night. So she has to help him escape from the enchantment. And books like these are really fun because they flesh out the story and develop the characters in a way that the original folktale just can't. Alright, so let's jump right into Echo North. Oh, also in this book, the author replaces the bear character with a wolf. Chapter 1. I was called Echo for my mother, who died when I was born, because when my father took me into his arms, he said he felt the echo of her heartbeat within me. My father didn't blame me for my mother's death, but he was often sad. He had me and my older brother, Rodia, to raise on his own, 2 mouths to feed and no dark-haired laughing wife to come home to. But he bore it all cheerfully. He gave me my freedom, and I loved both him and my brother fiercely. I was allowed to run barefoot in the summer, to tumble with the blacksmith's hounds, to skip my classes if I wished, and go fishing with Rodia in the lake. Not that my father wanted me to be ignorant. He taught me patiently from his books when we were at home together every evening. He read to me and asked me questions, and answered all my questions. I couldn't have been happier. I'd never known my mother. My father and Rodia were my whole world. And then, my whole world shifted. It happened the summer I was 7. Our village stood on the edge of a forest, and that year had been a particularly bad one for wolves attacking cattle and sheep in their fields. Old Man Tinker had set traps all around the village, and my father told me to watch for them carefully. Those traps could snap you in too, my darling, and what would I do without you? I promised him solemnly to take care. But, as I was coming back from picking wildflowers in the meadows, my embroidered skirts dirty about my knees, my kerchief forgotten somewhere amidst the waving grass, I heard a sharp, yelping scream, the sound of an animal in torment. I dropped my flowers, standing for an instant very still. The sound came again, and I ran toward it as quickly as I could. Round the corner, caught fast in a steel trap that butted up against a fence post, was a huge white wolf. I stared, frozen. For an instant, his pain seemingly forgotten, he stared back at me. I could feel him, not just looking, but seeing me, as if he were searching out something deep inside my soul. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. I felt drawn to him, connected to him. Then I glanced down and saw the blood staining his white fur, where the trap had caught his back left leg. I was brave. I was foolish. I went to help him without another thought. I knelt beside him in the dirt and touched him, gently, my small hand sinking into his white fur. It was the softest thing I had ever felt, softer even than the velvet cushion on my father's favorite chair. I knew I was right to want to help the wolf. I was certain it was the most important thing in all the world. I took a deep breath, grasped the jaws of the steel trap as firmly as I could, and pulled. I couldn't shift it, not even an inch. All I managed to do was jostle the trap against the wolf's wounded leg. He howled in pain and jerked away, a sudden whirl of claws and fur and snarling teeth. The trap was slippery with his blood, and I dropped it back onto the ground. He lunged against the trap, desperate and screeching, but it held him, the metal jaws biting deeper and deeper, down to the bone. The wolf grew more frantic with each passing second, and I started digging, tearing into the dirt around the stake and chain connected to those ugly metal jaws. The stake loosened. The wolf gave one last desperate yank and pulled it free. For an instant, joy and triumph filled me up. He leaped toward me in a blur of white, the trap and chain rattling behind him, and slammed into me with the force of an avalanche. Everything was all at once falling in fear, an impossible weight, darkness, a blinding, earth-shattering pain. The weight lifted, but something wet and awful was smeared across my eyes, and the world was distorted and bleared. It frightened me, even more than the darkness had. Pain pulsed through me, lines of raging fire in my chest, my shoulders, my face. Someone was screaming, and I realized it was me. I must have fainted, because when I opened my eyes again, my father was kneeling over me, his form warped and strange. The light was fading orange, and birds were singing in the wood. I was dizzy, my face and chest strangely numb. One of my eyes was swollen shut. Bits of rock and dirt had ground into my palms and behind my fingernails when I dug the stake from the ground. In that moment, it was the only pain I felt. "Let's carry her inside," I heard someone say. "She'll be all right, Peter. She's strong." Peter was my father. The other voice belonged to Old Man Tinker. He must have come to check his traps and found me there instead. My father scooped me into his arms, and I passed out again. The next time I tried to open my eyes, there was only darkness, and something thick and suffocating pressed against my face. "Papa!" I screamed. "Papa!" I jerked upright and fell in a tangle to the floor, and then my father was there, coaxing me back into bed, calming me down. "Just bandages, little bird. We'll take them off soon. Hush now, all is well." I clung to him, and he kissed me quietly on the forehead and sang me to sleep. Later, I don't know how much, they removed the bandage from my right eye. It gave me an oddly skewed view of the world, but it was better than no sight at all. We lived in a house back then, and I sat for many weeks in my room on the 3rd floor, watching through my little square window as the world below turned from the green and gold of summer to the red-brown blush of autumn. A host of doctors visited me, and I didn't understand why. I crept downstairs and listened shamelessly outside the door of my father's study while they talked about me. I heard things like, "never fully heal," and "the cuts were too deep," and "infection," and "lucky if she isn't blind." And then, one day, as the first of the winter snows blew soft across our village, the doctor came to take the bandage off the left side of my face. My father watched intently as the doctor peeled the cloth away, and I held my breath and waited for it to be over. Horror and shock flashed across my father's features, and for the first time I realized that what happened to me might not be able to be undone. "Cover your right eye," the doctor instructed. "Can you see out of the left one?" I lifted my hand and obeyed. The light was very bright, but I could see. I nodded. The doctor let out a breath of relief. My father shifted where he stood. The horror had left his expression, melding into a distance that unnerved me. "Is there anything you recommend for—" He trailed off, looking helplessly at the physician. "Not unless God gives her new skin," said the doctor. I think he meant it as a joke, but my father didn't even smile. I pushed back both of them and went out into the hall, padding to the room my mother had once shared with my father. She had a handsome mahogany vanity with a mirror above. I stepped up to it and looked in. 4 angry, jagged lines ran down the left side of my face, from my forehead all the way to my chin, the marks from the wolf's claws. My left eyelid was taut and scarred, my lips pulled up on one side. I stared at my reflection, feeling dull and strange. I covered the right half of my face with one hand, studying the scars for a long while, before switching to cover the left half, and studying in turn the smooth, untouched skin. Then I let my hand fall. I heard my father's step and turned to see him watching me from the doorway. "It isn't so bad, little lamb. They will fade over time." But sadness lingered in his eyes. He swept me into his arms, and I clung to his neck, sobbing, while he stroked my hair and wept with me a while. My father owned and ran the bookshop in our tiny village. He was excessively proud of it. It had a green door and a brass knocker, and a large shop window with carved wooden shutters. "It's not a large living," he always said, "but it's enough." Peter Alkayev, bookseller, was painted in bold red letters across the window. That was how I first learned to spell my last name. The summer after the incident with the wolf, My father sold our house, and my brother Rodya, and I moved into the apartments over the shop. I had my own little room with a tiny circle window that looked out over the street, and all the books I could ever want. My scars whitened as I got older. They didn't fade. I learned very early that in the old tales of magic, the wicked were always ugly and scarred, the good beautiful. I was not beautiful, but I wanted to be good, and after a while, I couldn't bear to read those stories anymore. The villagers avoided me. My fellow students crossed themselves when I walked by, or openly laughed at me. They said the devil had claimed my face, and would someday come back for the rest of me. They said he wouldn't have marked me if I didn't already belong to him. Once I tried to eat lunch with a girl called Sarah. She liked to read, same as me. She was always carrying around thick tomes of history or poetry or science, her nose permanently stuck between the pages. I thought that gave me the right to try and befriend her, but she spat in my face and pelted me with stones. I was the monster in her story. She was the heroine. I didn't try again. Once, I wandered into the apothecary and bought a jar of cream for 2 silver pennies, because the proprietor swore it would make the scars vanish completely by the end of the month. It didn't work, of course. Rodya found me crying in my bedroom, and I told him what I'd done. He made jokes at the apothecary's expense until I finally stopped crying and forced a smile for him. But I still felt like a fool. I buried the empty jar of cream in a little patch of earth behind the bookshop. It had been intended for a garden, but no one had ever planted anything, and it remained barren. I couldn't stand to confess what I'd done to my father. By the time I turned 15, I had read nearly every book in the shop, and my father hired me as his assistant. "Her face might frighten the devil who formed her," I overheard one of my father's patrons say, "but damned if she doesn't know every word of the classics, and can be counted on to point a fellow to the right book every time." This was one of the kindest things they said about me. There were many more less kind. I withdrew more and more, trying to lose myself in running the shop. I organized the shelves and reorganized them. I wrapped books in paper and string for customers. I wrote letters to the booksellers in the city, sending for rare volumes we didn't have. I kept my father's account books in order, and when business was slow, I went to our upstairs apartments and scoured the rooms clean, one by one. I kept busy, attempted to convince myself I was content. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shove away my loneliness, couldn't bury it in my mind like I'd buried the jar of cream in the dirt, where there ought to have been a garden. Chapter 2. A few months before my 16th birthday, my world inverted itself again. It was full winter, snow clinging to the shop window and the stones in the street. My toes had grown numb, even in my felted boots, and I closed the shop a little early and went upstairs to our apartments, an anatomy book tucked under each arm. Anatomy was my latest passion. I spent hours every day poring over medical notes and diagrams. I bustled about the living space, closing the shutters, lighting the lamps, coaxing the fire into a nice red roar. I cooked beef and noodles and cabbage, then lit the samovar and started boiling water. Between tasks, I read one of my books, an anatomical study of the heart, careful not to spill anything on the pages. I expected my father and Rodya at any moment. Rodya had apprenticed himself to the clockmaker in the village 6 months back, but he still came most nights for supper. My father had been gone on a mysterious errand since the morning. I hoped the snow wasn't delaying them overmuch, and I strained my ears to catch the sound of their footsteps on the stairs. It was Rodya who came first, stamping through the door in his thick boots, shaking snow from his hair and shrugging out of his coat. I waved him to his customary chair by the fire as I poured concentrated tea into a cup and added water from the samovar to dilute it, then did the same for myself. I settled down adjacent to him on our threadbare couch. We would wait until our father came home to eat our beef and noodles. Rodya yawned and sipped his tea. "Don't think Papa is coming tonight," he said conversationally, eyeing me over his cup. "Coming from where? Do you know where he's been today?" "At Donia's." My brother's lips quirked. I stared at him blankly. Donia was the baker's widow and had taken over the business when he passed away, but I had no idea what that had to do with my father. Sister, don't you listen to the gossip? I met Rhodia's dark eyes and frowned. None of the bookshop customers talked to me long enough to pass on rumors. Rhodia, just tell me. Papa is sweet on her. What? I dropped my teacup, yelping as the hot liquid splashed over my bare toes. Rhodia laughed as he laid his own cup down and knelt on the floor to help me clean up the mess. Mother's been gone a long time, dear heart. Papa deserves to be happy again. I won't be here forever, and neither will you. Won't you feel better knowing there's someone to take care of Papa when we're gone? I scooped the shards of the teacup into my apron and bustled from the room to avoid my brother's questions. When I'd emptied the pieces into the dustbin, I turned to find him watching me from his place in front of the fire. You won't be stuck here always, he said, reading my mind. My throat tightened. I haven't any options, Rhodia. I never have. Echo, I'll get our supper, I interrupted, since Papa's not coming. We ate together in silence, and I stared into the fire and hated myself. The noodles had cooked too long, and the beef was dry and the cabbage sour, but Rhodia ate every bite. He picked up one of my books from the end table when he'd finished, the one about the heart. I was nearly 3/4 of the way through it. You could go away to the university, he said. You're smart enough. Way smarter than me, maybe even smarter than Papa. They don't take girls at the university, I snapped. They're starting to, he objected, and they'd take you. Why don't you write to them? Anger and hope warred in my mind, but it was the anger that spilled out. And what then, Rhodia? A whole village of people to curse me as I walk by, to mock me and pelt me with stones? No, he said fiercely, a whole city of people who will admire your intellect, who will see you for yourself. I didn't have a chance to reply, because at that moment my father walked in, his beard dusted with flour and smelling of cinnamon, with the news he was to be married come spring. I've bought a house, my father announced the next afternoon, beaming at me over his tea while I wrapped up a stack of books to ship off to a customer in the city. A house? I was surprised. For Donia, he explained. She spent so many years in the cramped rooms above the bakery. She isn't keen on trading them for our upstairs apartments. I was hoping you would help me fix it up, to surprise her. We closed the shop early, bundled into our furs, and trudged 4 miles north from the village, through the previous day's snow. Nestled into the very edge of the forest was the house, a wooden cottage with a stone chimney that had intricate woodwork around the roof and patterned shutters. The windows were broken, the paint chipped, the shutters sagging. My father glanced over at me. You have to see its heart, love. Look past the flaws. He fished a key out of his pocket and unlocked the door. We stepped in, onto creaky wooden floors overstrewn with dirt and leaves that had blown in through the broken windows. The wallpaper was torn and faded, the carpet in front of the dead hearth threadbare. But even so, my father was right. It had a good heart. He took my hand, like he hadn't done since I was a young child, and led me quietly through the whole house, parlor, sitting room, kitchen, then upstairs to the 2 bedrooms and private lavatory. We climbed one more creaky staircase to a charming attic room, with a sloped roof and a large window overlooking the woods. It was in less disrepair than the rest of the house, and I got the feeling it hadn't really been lived in by the cottage's former occupants. I loved it instantly. My father could tell. It's yours if you want it. I doubt Donia will want to climb up this way very often. I hugged him, because I knew he'd picked the room out specifically for me. We tramped back down to the main floor. Can we really afford it, though, Papa? He smiled. I signed the papers this morning. This wasn't quite an answer, but I reasoned with a little careful planning and penny hoarding, we could make it work. We walked back to the bookshop in the gathering dark, discussing what needed to be done to make the cottage livable. It started snowing again, but I hardly felt the cold, warmed by my father's love for me, and knowing that not even a stepmother could take that away. After weeks of working on the house in shifts, mostly my father and me, with Rhodia helping when he could, my father finally deemed the cottage ready for Donia's approval. Rhodia took the afternoon off from the clockmakers, and the 3 of us waited at the bookshop for her to join us. I was nervous and jittery. This would be the first time I'd really met my almost stepmother. I'd invited her to dinner on several occasions, but she hadn't been able to come, too occupied with arranging the sale of the bakery to pay for her late husband's debts. She swept into the shop all bright and bustling, an expensive-looking fur coat fastened around her shoulders, a gold-embroidered sarafan just beneath. She reminded me of an Arctic bear, tall and broad, with rosy cheeks and strong arms from years of kneading bread and shoveling loaves in and out of ovens. She greeted my brother and father, and then approached me with her arms outstretched. "Echo, dear!" She embraced me in a careful manner, like she wished to give the appearance of affection without getting overly close to me. She kissed the air on both sides of my face. "Well, let me look at you." Her tone was too bright. Her eyes swept me up and down, lingering at first too long on my scars, and then too briefly. She repeated, "Echo, dear." It was in a more false-sounding voice than before. My father's glance flicked anxiously between us, and I tried to smile to put him at ease. "Shall we go and see the house?" We left the shop, my father and Donia leading, me and Rhodia behind. It was Sunday, and winter was beginning to fade from the world. The air held the faintest hint of springtime. Everything should have seemed fresh and new and hopeful, but my heart was a tumult of unease. We climbed the hill that looked down onto the cottage, and Donia gasped in delight. "Oh, Peter, how lovely!" She was more subdued once we actually entered the house. Her eyes swept around the rooms with relentless scrutiny, lingering especially long on the curtains I'd sewn, and the rug I'd bought from the town seamstress and lugged all the way from the village. We followed Donia up to the attic room, where I had a sudden moment of panic she would claim it for her own. But my father came to the rescue. "I thought this would do very well for Echo. What do you think, my dear?" Donia glanced about again and gave a regal jerk of her chin. "I can't think the room would have any other use. It's far too inconvenient. Yes, Echo may have it." I looked aside at my father in time to see him wink at me. Back downstairs again, Donia took one more turn through the lower floor, nodding as she rejoined us by the hearth. "It will do, Peter. It certainly will do." My father breathed a sigh of relief, suddenly all smiles. Donia beamed at him. "It only wants a woman's touch. The curtains will have to go at once, of course. They're perfectly dreadful. And that rug, too. We'll need furniture." She raised her hand to forestall my father. "Not the furniture from your apartment, dear. New furniture, and new linens and carpets. We will have to manage with just that for now." "Just that?" My father studied her quizzically. "I'll need a writing desk eventually. All new wallpaper, certainly, and a piano. I was quite the songbird, you know, when I was small. I've longed for a piano these many years." "The wallpaper is new," I interrupted. Donia fixed her dark eyes on my face. "I beg your pardon, Echo." Her tone turned her meaning to, "How dare you speak to me?" "The wallpaper is new," I repeated. "I picked it out myself, and I know where to get more to match when we can afford it. I sewed the curtains. I thought they brightened the room considerably. I'm sorry you don't like them." Donia frowned. Her dislike pulsed toward me with the intensity of a heat wave, but she only said in a mild tone, "You ought to have consulted me first. They are not at all to my taste." "Though I'm sure Donia greatly appreciates your efforts," my father put in gently. Donia glanced at him, then back at me. Her jaw tightened. "I'm sure I do, however misguided. Now, Peter, about the furniture," and she turned her back to me. Rhodia tugged me firmly outside. We paced around the back of the house and sat on the stoop. I stared at the patch of earth where I'd spent a whole afternoon pulling out brambles, planning to grow vegetables when the weather got a little warmer, if Donia allowed it, that is. Rhodia bumped my shoulder with his. "Don't mind her, Echo. She's just jealous of Papa's affection for you." I chewed on my lip and stared into the woods, straining for glimpses of green on the bare, black branches. I thought I saw a flash of white between the trees, the sudden gleam of an amber eye. But then I blinked and there was nothing there. She hates me because of my face. That isn't true. Of course it is. I tugged my kerchief off my hair, closing my eyes and leaning into the wind. The scars still hurt sometimes, a twinge of pain when the weather was turning. You have to stop disparaging yourself. No one gives a damn about your scars. I give a damn, I said fiercely. Then stop. There isn't a single thing you can do about them, and you're too brilliant a person to waste your life bowing and scraping to dimwits in the bookshop. No matter how much you might deny it, Echo Alkayev, you are extraordinary. You have been since the moment you were born. I reached up to touch my scars, but Rodya caught my hand and laid it in my lap again. Write to the university, please. I refocused on Rodya, tracing every line of his dear face, and hope sparked inside me. I'll write them, I promised. If you liked this book, you can request it from the library. And I hope you enjoyed this week's story. Have a great weekend. Bye.